Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today at Genius Machines 2020 Virtual Summit. I'm Daniela Fayer. I'm the publisher at Defense One, and I'm excited to continue today's conversation on emerging technologies and talk a bit more about the future of network architectures. Joining me today is Jim Westdorp. He's the Chief Technologist at Ciena Government Solutions. Welcome, Jim. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Danielle. Happy to be here.
So Jim, before we get into our conversation, I thought it would be nice for you to just take a moment for our audience and tell us a little bit about your role at Ciena and your background and how you arrived at this point in your career.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I've been in the industry for quite some time. Actually, I've been at Ciena for over 22 years now. I've been through the startup phase and the maturation, and I've got to watch Ciena become a technology leader in our space. So that's all been pretty exciting. Before that, I was actually in the defense industry, working for a defense systems integrator. And my background is in high-speed communications, telecommunications, computer systems, and being able to put all that together in support of our government customers, because actually I work for Ciena Government Solutions and really support the team there in coming up with solutions for our government customers as they as they try to keep their networks and critical infrastructure up to date.
That's great. Thank you so much for that background. I think that really helps the audience understand where you're coming from. And so given your background, I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges you see in the federal space right now, in particular in terms of network infrastructure and their innovation efforts in that realm?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting time to be in the network infrastructure business. All the things that are going on in the world. We've always seen, certainly in my experience with Ciena for the last 20 years, we always think that the need for bandwidth is gonna slow down, and it hasn't. And I don't really see that happening in the future either. So it's really a dynamic time to be in the industry. But in terms of some of the challenges that our customers in the federal space see, that rapid pace of technology that I was talking about is definitely a challenge. Many of the larger government enterprises and networks, it's hard for them to keep up, and so that's a challenge for them. The workforce that's in the federal space force, that's under stress as well. There are not as many folks who are available to work on some of these network infrastructure projects that they're used to, because of the rapid pace of change. Some of the folks who there are not necessarily as up to speed as I'm sure they would like to be. So there's some expertise gaps that have to be filled. And there's the usual, anytime we're talking about government and why how things can be changed to make things go quicker or whatnot. The procurement process continues to be a challenge. It's something we all have to deal with, but it is one of the things that continues to make things maybe a little more slow than people would want. And then there's some of the unique aspects of many government networks in that they've been existing for a long time. The government, of course, has been one of the one of the early adopters early on to some of the network technologies, but they've kept with that technology in their networks because they're not able to keep up with the rapid pace of change. So there is a lot of legacy protocols, legacy equipment in the networks, and you have to deal with that as part of the upgrade process, and making sure that you've got an architecture and a set of equipment that can not only handle modern infrastructure and modern protocols, but still deal seamlessly with some of the older ones that have to exist, is very important.
Nothing like challenges to reprioritize things and
Yes.
Put a lens of focus on.
No shortage of challenges, but that's why we exist, is to help solve some of those.
Absolutely. So I want you to unravel a mystery for me.
Okay.
This term network as a service. Can you tell me a little bit about, what that is, demystify it for our audience today?
Sure. It's a good acronym, NAAS, right? We have almost everything as a service now, right? Software as a service, infrastructure as a service, network as a service. But in this particular context, it's actually a pretty self-descriptive acronym. It's really about providing a network service that normally would be provided, or historically would have been provided, by dedicated infrastructure, right? A carrier, an integrator would have shown up in the trucks. They would have provided hardware and connectivity services, and it would have been nailed up, and they'd hook it up between your different enterprise buildings, and it would be there for you, and it wouldn't change unless you wrote a new contract, et cetera. But with modern infrastructure, and with really the very high capacities and the flexibility that modern infrastructure has, we now have the ability to provide a service which carriers have been providing for years, right? Providing a network to an enterprise, that's what they exist to do. But network as a service is really a way to provide that dedicated network connectivity that they've always provided, but to do it in a more cost-effective and a more flexible way by using converged infrastructure. So in the past, they would have provided, like I said, fixed function, dedicated infrastructure for a particular enterprise. And that worked, and that was really the only way it could be done years ago. But nowadays, we have a very high capacity infrastructure that can support multiple services and multiple enterprises on it. And you'd like to be able to leverage that common infrastructure so that you can get efficiencies of scale, cost efficiencies, and provide flexibility, so that when an enterprise says, hey, I've had 10 buildings on net and I want to add, I just bring a new building or a new set of users online, or a new mission, whatever, I want to get those connected on net, and I want it to be seamless, and I want it to happen in a couple of days instead of several weeks. And with network as a service, with the flexibility and automation that provides, that's now possible. So it's really about network as a service is really about taking advantage of the advances in what I'll call adaptive network, to allow segmented, dedicated networks to be provided to enterprises and to customers, but using cost-effective shared resources that can be quickly deployed and more easily managed.
So just another tool in the arsenal, in our evolution. So let's talk a little bit about modernization of network operations and business architectures.
Sure.
What does that journey look like given these new set of tools?
Yeah. So, the first step in any kind of modernization process is really to take a step back and look at what your current needs are, what your current processes are, and talk to your end users and have a look at what sorts of missions and capabilities that they need, and have that inform the direction that you take in your network upgrade process. So a network assessment is something that definitely needs to happen. Ciena has services where we can come in and bring people who've done this multiple times before and can offer good advice and have seen some of the problems that enterprises and government enterprises have, and be able to make some suggestions on how best to modernize. So there's an assessment phase to do that. Look for over and underutilized areas of the network, places where you want to make some changes first. And then also when you're looking at the kinds of services that you want to implement, take a look at some of the processes in the network operations center. Look at the ones that are taking the most time or the most resources, and make selective investments in automation and infrastructure upgrades to address those gaps that you find. And then last but not least, just to tag on to what I said earlier in terms of one of the challenges, which is some of the legacy infrastructure and legacy equipment that's there. Choose equipment and architectures that allow a migration from legacy services and legacy protocols to a more modern one. So you have to have a solution that has kind of a feet in both worlds. It can support both the older capabilities that are in your network and are not going to get swept out immediately. Yes, we want to migrate and get them, become more modern, but you can't get them out right away. So you're going to end up having to do a migration. You want to have processes, automation, and equipment that supports that migration.
Thank you. I think that gives a real map for anybody who's looking into this. And you mentioned automation. We had a lot of sessions, editorial sessions today in our larger event about moving towards automation.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into network as a service model, into that model?
Yeah, good question. And they really are very, very closely linked. Honestly, you can't really go down a network as a service path or really go very far down that journey unless you have the automation because, as I said, it's about using the flexible and, high performance infrastructure that you built for multiple purposes and to support multiple different constituencies. And you can't do that unless you have the automation that allows you to manage and take advantage of that flexibility. So yeah, really, automation and network as a service go hand in hand.
And I know we're always talking about emerging technologies, and sometimes I feel as if these things are so complex potentially that, we're not going to get there for another decade. So, it's something that you have to look forward to.
It feels that way sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you, Jim, like how can agencies work today, like to implement network as a service as a solution? Like how can they get this going very, more rapidly?
And we see this in some of our customers where I think sometimes they feel like they've got a relatively long in the tooth network or an architecture they've been living with for a long time, and they feel like they just need to make a big change, and the enormity of that causes them to take longer than they want. And right, they're thinking, wow, how do I get started in this? And my advice there is, it's the same for most big projects. You don't eat the whole thing all at once. You start small. So in most cases, and anything other than a really pathologically bad case, there's no reason that you have to go and just do a big bang and upgrade the whole network. There's a whole lot of reasons why you don't want to do that. The risks are high. If there's any kind of mistakes, it has far-reaching effects. So really, you can and you should start small. Identify key users and for most networks, key geographies where you have the most need, and start there. Work with your carrier partners, work with your integration partners to upgrade the network a portion at a time. And in that way, you can start to get benefits sooner. You'll gain experience and know how better to upgrade your network and to service your customers, your end customers, as you go through that process.
So walk before you run.
Yeah, walk before you run.
Yeah, I always recommend that. That's you can mitigate risk there in anything that you're doing. Take a step forward versus.
Yeah, and like I said, the network technologies, they are such that you don't have to do everything at once. There's backward compatibility modes, so you can work with the existing infrastructure, do it a piece at a time, figure out what works best for your agency and your enterprise. Take that learnings and take that forward in the next phase, and iterate.
It's great advice. Of course, always a big concern for the federal government and in particular the defense community is security of critical information, of the data, protecting the data.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you could touch on how network as a service keeps data secure. That's got to be the number one question in embarking anything like this, embarking on this.
Yeah, we get those, right. We get those kind of questions a lot, as you might expect. And given that network as a service, almost by definition, requires that you're going to use converged infrastructure. So you've got multiple customers' data, on the same overall network infrastructure. And, many times you don't want that stuff to mix. And you want protections in place so that if, configuration-wise, if something happens and they do mix, you still don't have, data breaches or security or confidentiality issues. And what I would say is, network as a service itself, there's nothing inherently secure or insecure about it. It's a technology. But in order to use it in a way that's important to the government enterprise and takes into account the security concerns, you have to make sure that it's implemented in such a way that is secure and that you've layered the appropriate protections on top of that. So a couple of things I'd say. These days, ubiquitous and multi-layer encryption is is there. So you can do encryption at multiple layers, and in fact, you want to do that. We as Ciena, we provide encryption at the bulk layer, at our layer, which is the lower layers, layer 0 through layer 2, so that you can protect the actual fiber infrastructure itself, so that everything that goes across the fiber is encrypted. So if there's a fiber cut or some kind of compromise, the bad guys don't get access to it. And then you also want to do additional encryption at the higher layers, at the application layer. So if there's some kind of misconfiguration, and the data from one customer shows up on the port of another one's, shouldn't happen, but you can misconfigure things. Then again, there's additional layer of encryption on top of that to protect that. So have a multi-layer encryption approach, which is supported by the technologies today. Is probably first and foremost how you protect the data as it's in flight across the network. And then you're going to use the segmentation capabilities that are inherent in the equipment these days. You can, if you're at the Ethernet layer, there's virtual LAN tags. If you're at the lower layers, you can segment by wavelength. So, and if you're at layer 1, you can segment by OTN time slots. So there's ways at each layer of the network to segment and make sure the traffic is kept separate. Then you encrypt it at those multiple layers. And then I'd say the last thing that's important is to make sure that you've got rigor in the process that you use to apply all these technologies that I talked about. There's a lot of best practice information. The NIST framework is out there. FedRAMP is there. For critical infrastructure, the NERC and FERC standards are there to really guide you in terms of establishing not only the technology, but the processes that you use to implement the network as a service, so that it is secure. So I would say it's not a technology problem anymore. It's really a process and procurement issue. And yes, we can make them secure.
So Jim, how about some specific examples, case studies, perhaps on specific network modernization projects that you've seen, and how can industry partners, work better with the federal government that you've seen?
Sure. I would say most of the upgrades that we're seeing today are along the lines of doing capacity and critical infrastructure work. So, they're wanting to support the higher speeds. Used to be 10 gig was a high speed. They've moved to 100 gig, and actually we're just now starting to see move to 400 gigabit Ethernet. So again, big step function changes in capacity are there. And I would say most of our customers who are doing network modernization projects, that's where they start. They get the capacity upgrades in place, and they also lay the foundation for some of these network as a service and some of these more advanced automation capabilities by deploying hardware and services that are themselves flexible, so that they're inherently upgradable and automatable, if we can make that a verb. But they allow the network to be automated more efficiently going forward. So those things are happening now. And I would say that the higher levels of automation, the network as a service, automating service provisioning, things like that, that we're just starting to see. But we're going to see a lot more of that once the underlying infrastructure has been upgraded to be capable of automation. Layering in the automation software and processes at the network operations center is really the next thing that we're seeing. And in terms of working better with the federal government, I would say we in industry are very much interested in working with our customers. I would say talk to us. There are a number of venues for that. There's sessions like this where we try to get the word out in terms of the capabilities that we have in industry. Of course, there's a number of different procurement vehicles. We're open to a number of different ones. Classic EIS. There's a number of OTA kind of contractual vehicles that we're open to that can can try to break through some of the log jams we have in the procurement environment. So, you know, there's things like that. And then, you know, government industry should talk to each other in terms of what they're learning and what's worked best for them. We can certainly provide examples of best practices that we've seen from other customers. You know, really, I would say just keep the conversation going, and you know, reach out to us. We of course are gonna do the same.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. But Jim, thank you for the conversation today.
Great, appreciate it, Daniela.
I think it's great advice. I think our audience has gained some really valuable insights today, and we appreciate your support of today's program. Thank you. Thanks again to our audience for watching, and be sure to stay tuned for our next session.